Ceann Comhairle. First of all, I want to agree with the points made by the last speaker on the common fisheries policy. It has created not just decimation of fisher communities, but an ecological disaster, and is totally unsustainable. And having looked at the Oireachtas poll this morning, north and south of the border, it's actually quite remarkable how favourably Irish people look upon the EU. The polling results are quite positive for the EU. This has given the major bank bailout of €67 billion imposed on the Irish people after the bank bailout in 2008, which caused an awful lot of pain. And those of us who've been attending hustings with the social rights sector in particular will realise very quickly that a lot of that low-hanging fruit that was plucked by the government during that austerity has not been reinstated to help communities redevelop in terms of youth services, community-based services, drug addiction services, etc. I think it's an important point to make. But it is interesting to see that the majority believe that Ireland should remain in the European Union. And there's only more than half of the sample polled think that Europe is going in the right direction. But that's only half. The other half think it's going in the wrong direction, and I want to repeat that word several times. The wrong direction, it needs to change direction. I don't think anyone's screaming for to get us out of the European Union. Ireland's status as a member remains high in the minds of people, both in the Republic and in the north of Ireland, and most people believe that it's important to vote in the European elections. Europe was founded on the statement that it values the respect of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights, including the rights of persons to belong to minorities. And these values are common to member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity and equality between men and women prevail. So I think it's worth measuring that statement against the current situation. More than half the people in both jurisdictions, say they are not satisfied with Europe's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with around one-third saying that they were satisfied. So what we have is the approval for Russia's, the way the EU is handling the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is going downwards. But more sort of stark in the findings is that there's even less approval for the EU's response to the way the Israeli-Gaza conflict has been handled, or should I say the war by Israel on Gaza. 64% in the Republic and 72% in the North reported being unsatisfied. And on some of the major geopolitical crises of our time, war in the Ukraine, migration, the conflict in Gaza, the research highlights the challenges that the EU face, both in uniting Europe but also in responding to it properly. The dissatisfaction with the direction the EU is going is very high on the question of Palestine, because the EU is backing to the hilt Israel's right to so-called self-defence, when we all know that it's a genocide, that it's the creation of famine, of butchery, of slaughter, and it is only getting worse. And at the same time, some of the biggest arms suppliers to Israel come from Europe. If it were not steeped in hypocrisy, Europe would impose an immediate arms ban on Israel, but it is steeped in hypocrisy, and it reeks of that hypocrisy on many fronts. If you take, for example, even in this House, I mentioned it this morning, we have done nothing to act on Gaza. Students down the road from us in Trinity, after 5 days of an occupation, have enforced a divestment policy from Trinity College with Israel. But instead, what we do is, each day, we go into our offices and we use Hewlett-Packard equipment, Hewlett-Packard who provide computer hardware to the Israeli army and maintain data centres for the Israeli police. Hewlett-Packard also have the contracts for all of the local authorities, at least any of the ones that I know of, and we're constantly told that procurement rules are governed by the relevant directives of the European Union. Now, Minister, I'd like to ask you how you can suggest that we don't have the right to pick and choose whom we enter into contracts with, and if it is absolutely the case that we cannot break the contract that this House and the local authorities have with public money with this provider of death or machines to carry out death on the Palestinian people through the Israeli army. The other aspect of hypocrisy I want to touch on briefly is on climate change. The European Union the last time around, had it at the top of its agenda. For its next 5-year top of agenda strategic goals, climate doesn't even feature. And yet we know we are hurtling towards the worst damaging period in terms of the planet, and that this continent heats up faster than any other part of the world. So we need to address the question of the derogation or the downgrading of climate change in terms of the priorities. Free public transport instead of electric cars would do a hell of a lot for this continent. If Europe were to pursue each member state to say bring in free frequent public transport, we could really focus on trying to do something about the climate disaster that we have. And finally, I want to finish on the question of the EU Migration Pact. We had some debate on it last week, but what wasn't debated, not nearly enough, is the breach of the statement that I read out on which the EU is founded on the question of humanitarianism, equality, respect for dignity, respect for minorities, being breached left, right and centre by that migration pact, which will basically allow the EU to build a wall against asylum seekers, funding warlords in Libya and extending that model to other third countries such as Egypt and Tunisia, where people are locked up, where they are kept in detention centres, where at this point in Libya they are bought and sold as slaves. How the world is going backward under the guise of a progressive EU. And yes, we do need a change in direction, and the EU should stop operating as a cover for the sort of turbo capitalism that it does and start building a Europe that's for people and not for the profit of a tiny few. Poverty is increasing, inequality is increasing, and the scandal of migration and the support for Israel doing nothing about Palestine is an absolute stain on the record of the EU and the humanity for the people who live within it.
Now, the next